The humidity in the study was thick, smelling of old leather and the expensive cigars my father kept in a humidor that cost more than my car. I was 18 years old, clutching an acceptance letter to the University of Washington's computer science program like it was a golden ticket. I remember the exact weight of the paper, heavy, embossed, the kind of paper that promised a future. Elias didn't look up from his ledger. He didn't even acknowledge the letter I'd placed on the mahogany desk. He just tapped his fountain pen against his thumb, a rhythmic, clinical sound. "I spoke to the bursar," he said, his voice as cold as a winter morning in Seattle. "I've decided not to release the funds for your tuition, Marcus." I felt the air leave my lungs. "What do you mean?" "The trust, you said once I got in it was settled." "It's settled that you've been comfortable for too long," he replied, finally meeting my gaze. His eyes weren't angry, they were worse. They were disappointed. "This degree is a luxury for people who have the stomach to build something. But you're soft, Marcus. You've spent your life in the shade of my achievements, thinking that the Reed name is a scholarship. It's not. It's a standard. And frankly, you don't have the grit to meet it. If I pay for this, I'm just subsidizing your inevitable failure." He reached out and pushed the acceptance letter back toward me with the tip of his pen, as if it were a piece of contaminated evidence. "If you want to be a man of industry, go find an industry that will have you. But as of this moment, you are on your own. No allowance, no tuition, no safety net. Let's see how that brilliant mind of yours works when you're hungry." I stood there, the silence of the room ringing in my ears. I wanted to scream, to plead, to point out that he had inherited his own start from a grandfather he barely remembered. But the look in his eyes told me he was waiting for me to break. He wanted me to beg so he could prove I was as weak as he suspected. Instead, I picked up the letter. I didn't say a word. I turned and walked out of that study, out of the house, and into a world that suddenly felt massive and terrifyingly empty. He thought he was teaching me a lesson about the world's cruelty. He didn't realize he was giving me the only thing I actually needed, the absolute certainty that I owed him nothing. As I stood on the sidewalk with my single suitcase, the heat of the Arizona sun felt like a brand. I was 18, I had $42 in my pocket, and I had just begun the longest game of his life. The transition from the cooled air of my father's study to the sweltering asphalt of a roadside construction site was a physical blow. For the first 6 months, my world was reduced to the smell of diesel and the grit of drywall dust that never quite washed out of my pores. I worked 10-hour shifts hauling lumber and pouring concrete, muscles screaming in a language I hadn't known they spoke. My father had wanted to see how my mind worked when I was hungry. The irony was that hunger made my mind sharper, colder, and far more disciplined than the soft life he had provided ever could. By day I was a laborer. By night I was a ghost in the city library. I would sit in the back corner of the reference section, my knuckles swollen and stained with grease, typing lines of code onto a refurbished laptop that hummed like a lawnmower. Dinner was a 25-cent packet of ramen eaten dry or softened with lukewarm tap water in a plastic bowl. I measured my life in syntax and logic gates. While my former classmates were posting photos of fraternity mixers and Saturday tailgates, I was teaching myself the architecture of the future between shifts at a 24-hour warehouse. I eventually found a basement apartment that was little more than a concrete box with a single flickering light bulb. It was damp, cramped, and smelled faintly of mildew, but it was mine. I set up a makeshift desk using 2 crates and a discarded door. That basement became my laboratory. I stopped looking at the clock. I only looked at the compiler. I was building an app, a simple, elegant solution for peer-to-peer educational tutoring, born from the frustration of being a student who couldn't afford a teacher. There were nights when the cold seeped through the floorboards and the hunger felt like a physical weight in my stomach. On those nights, I would think of the brass plaques in my father's hallway. I would visualize his disappointed gaze and the way he had pushed my acceptance letter back with the tip of his pen. He thought he had cut me adrift to watch me drown. He didn't realize he had dropped me into the water only to find out I was the one who knew how to build the ship. Every line of code was a strike against his legacy. Every bug I fixed was a step toward a world where a name didn't buy a future. I wasn't just building software. I was building an exit strategy from the Reed shadow, 1 cent and 1 semicolon at a time. The basement dampness eventually gave way to the hum of high-end servers and the floor-to-ceiling glass of a Palo Alto corner office. In the 5 years that followed my hungry years, my little tutoring app had evolved into Novice Ed, a global powerhouse in educational technology. I wasn't just a coder anymore, I was a disruptor. I had built a company that made learning accessible to anyone with a signal, regardless of the name on their birth certificate. My father's world was built on exclusion, mine was built on scale. Success at that level brings a specific kind of noise, award ceremonies, magazine covers, and an endless stream of solicitations. But it was the thick, cream-colored envelope sitting on my desk that morning that finally stopped the clock. It was embossed with the crest of St. Jude's Academy, my father's alma mater. The letter was a plea for a lead donor for their centenary expansion. The school was falling behind the digital curve, and their board of directors was desperate for a partnership with a tech leader who understood the future of prestige. As I scanned the list of current emeritus donors, my breath hitched. There it was, Elias Reed. He was still there, a small fish in a shrinking pond, likely holding onto his seat on the board by his fingernails while the world moved on without him. The irony was delicious. The very institution that had served as the benchmark for my failure was now on its knees before my balance sheet. They didn't know I was a Reed. I had dropped the family name from my professional profile years ago, operating simply as M.J. Novice. To them, I was just a faceless titan of industry with deep pockets and a reputation for unsupported grit. I called my chief of staff into the room. I told her we would not only meet the donation goal, but we would triple it. There was one condition. The donation had to remain anonymous until the night of the anniversary gala, and I was to be the keynote speaker. I wanted to see the look on the board's faces when they realized who was saving their legacy. More importantly, I wanted to see the look on one specific face in the front row. My father had once told me that the Reed name was a standard I couldn't meet. Now, I was going to show him that I didn't just meet the standard, I owned the building it was housed in. I wasn't just giving back to a school, I was buying the final piece of my own narrative. The trap was set, the check was signed, and for the first time in a decade, I felt a cold, familiar spark of anticipation. It was time to go back to school. The logistics of the St. Jude Centenary Gala were handled with the same surgical precision I applied to a multi-billion-dollar acquisition. I oversaw every detail of the guest list personally, ensuring the VIP gold envelopes were dispatched via private courier. I wanted the weight of the cardstock to feel significant in my father's hands. I wanted the gold foil to blind him to the truth. The invitation was specifically designed to appeal to Elias's greatest weakness, his vanity. It didn't just invite him, it framed him as a cornerstone of the institution's history. In recognition of the Reed legacy, the script read, "We request the presence of our most esteemed emeritus donor as a guest of honor at the unveiling of the Century Project." I knew exactly how he would read those words. He would see them as a formal apology from the universe for his waning influence. He would believe the school had finally realized they couldn't survive without his name. I sat in my office watching the RSVP tracker on my screen. When his confirmation hit the system, a cold shiver of satisfaction traced my spine. He hadn't just accepted. He had called the headmaster's office to request a front row seat for his immediate family. He still thought he was the sun around which this entire event orbited. He was already preparing a speech in his head, a collection of platitudes about tradition and the grit required to maintain a family dynasty. To ensure he remained comfortably in the dark, I funneled the donation through a shell foundation named the Sisyphus Fund. It was a private joke, a nod to the man who was condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity, much like I had spent my 20s clawing my way out of the hole Elias had dug for me. The school's administration was sworn to absolute secrecy, blinded by the sheer size of the endowment. They were so grateful for the money that they didn't question why the CEO of Novice Ed insisted on being introduced only as the architect of the future. On the night before the gala, I received a rare, automated notification from a legacy social media account I hadn't checked in years. It was a photo Elias had posted, a shot of his tuxedo laid out on his bed, the St. Jude's crest cufflinks glinting in the light. The caption read, "Reflecting on the importance of legacy tonight. Some things are simply bred into the bone." I closed my laptop and looked out at the San Francisco skyline. He was right about one thing, some things are bred into the bone. But it wasn't the name that mattered. It was the scars he had given me, which had hardened into a suit of armor he wouldn't be able to pierce. He thought he was walking into his coronation. He didn't realize he was walking into my courtroom. The air inside the St. Jude's ballroom was heavy with the scent of lilies and the hushed, rhythmic clinking of silver against crystal. It was a sound I remembered from a dozen childhood fundraisers. The sound of old money reassuring itself of its own permanence. I stayed in the periphery, moving through the shadows of the velvet-draped columns, a ghost in a bespoke suit that cost more than my father's first house. I spotted him near the center of the room, standing beneath a massive chandelier that cast sharp, jagged shadows across his face. Elias looked exactly as he had a decade ago, perhaps a bit thinner, his hair a more clinical shade of silver, but the posture was unmistakable. He stood with his chin tilted slightly upward, the practiced stance of a man who believed the floor only existed to support his weight. He was surrounded by a small circle of his contemporaries, men who had inherited their fortunes and women who wore their family jewels like armor. As I drifted closer, blending into a group of younger alumni, his voice drifted over the crowd, booming with a self-assurance that made my jaw tighten. "It's about the roots, Arthur," Elias said, gesturing with a champagne flute toward the school's crest on the far wall. "St. Jude's is a garden. You can't just plant anything here and expect it to bloom. It takes a specific kind of stock. That's why the Reed legacy has always been the backbone of this expansion. We understand that excellence isn't something you buy, it's something you're born with." He let out a short, dry laugh, the kind that always signaled he was about to deliver a punchline. "I've always said you can give a man a map, but if he doesn't have the internal compass, he'll just end up lost in the woods. My own son, for instance. Well, Marcus chose a different path. Some people simply lack the constitution for this kind of weight." The group chuckled, a polite, sycophantic sound that echoed off the high ceilings. I watched as he took a sip of his vintage Krug, his eyes scanning the room with the restless hunger of a man who felt his relevance slipping away and was desperate to grab it back. He thought he was the guest of honor. He thought his presence tonight was a validation of his stock and his compass. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold, hard edge of my phone. In less than 20 minutes, the lights would dim, and the architect of the future would be called to the podium. Elias was enjoying his last few minutes of being the narrator of our family story. He was leaning into the velvet rope of his own ego, blissfully unaware that the rope had already been cut. I took a deep breath, the scent of the lilies suddenly smelling less like a celebration and more like a funeral for the man he used to be. The stage was set, and for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't the one lost in the woods. I was the one who had cleared the forest. The lights in the ballroom dimmed, and a spotlight cut through the residual chatter, centering on the podium where Headmaster Sterling stood. He looked energized, his face flushed with the kind of excitement that only an 8-figure check can generate. My father was leaning forward in the front row, his hands resting on his knees, a smug, proprietary smile fixed on his face. He was ready to be named the architect of this new era. "Tonight, we celebrate a century of excellence," Sterling began, his voice echoing with practiced gravitas. "But more importantly, we secure a second century. For months, there has been speculation regarding the anonymous benefactor behind the Century Project. This donor didn't just meet our needs, they redefined our potential with a record-breaking donation of $15 million. A collective gasp rippled through the room. I watched Elias's posture change. His smile faltered, replaced by a look of intense, frantic calculation. He knew his own foundation hadn't authorized a fraction of that amount. He looked at Arthur, then at the other board members, searching for the real power in the room, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. "The visionary behind this gift is a leader who believes that grit and innovation are the only true legacies," Sterling continued. "It is my profound honor to introduce the CEO of Novice Ed, and a former student of St. Jude's, Mr. Marcus Reed." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a vacuum being created as every person in the room turned to watch the shadows. I stepped out from behind the velvet-draped column and walked toward the light. The walk to the stage felt like it lasted a decade. With every step, I felt the weight of the ramen years, and the construction dust falling away. When I reached the stairs, I looked down. Elias was less than 5 feet from me. His face was no longer pale, it was gray. His mouth was slightly open, his hand frozen in midair as if he were trying to catch a ghost. He wasn't looking at a titan of industry, he was looking at the soft boy he had discarded on a sidewalk 10 years ago. I didn't smile at him. I didn't acknowledge the shock that was vibrating through his frame. I simply climbed the stairs, shook the headmaster's hand, and adjusted the microphone. The applause was deafening, a wall of sound that validated every sleepless night in that damp basement. I looked out over the crowd, but my focus remained on the front row. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been demolished. I wasn't here to join his legacy. I was here to announce that his was over and mine had just begun. I stood at the podium, the silence in the room so heavy it felt structural. The glare of the spotlight made the rest of the world fall away, leaving only me and the gray shattered mask of my father's face in the front row. I didn't reach for my notes. I didn't need them. 10 years ago, I began, my voice steady and amplified. I stood in a room very much like this one and was told that a legacy is something you inherit, a torch passed down to those who are deemed worthy of the name. I was told that without a safety net, I would fail. That without the family brand I was nothing. I paused, letting the words settle. A few people in the back shifted uncomfortably, sensing the temperature in the room drop. For a long time I believed that. I believed that my success was dependent on the approval of a man who viewed his own son as a bad investment. But tonight, as we celebrate the Century Project, I want to offer a different perspective on what it means to build something that lasts. I turned my gaze directly to Elias. He looked small. For the first time in my life, the man who had loomed like a mountain looked like a pebble. I want to thank the person who made this $15 million donation possible, I said, a faint, razor-thin smile touching my lips. I want to thank the man who refused to pay my tuition. I want to thank the man who left me on a sidewalk with $42 and a suitcase. Because in that moment of absolute abandonment, he gave me the greatest gift a founder can ever receive. He gave me the gift of being alone. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. When you have no legacy to hide behind, you have to build your own. When you are told you lack grit, you go out and find it in the dirt of construction sites in the cold light of 3 a.m. coding sessions. My father thought he was teaching me about failure. He didn't realize he was teaching me about autonomy. He thought he was protecting his name. Instead, he forced me to make mine more valuable than his ever was. I looked out at the rows of wealthy donors, the people who had spent their lives polishing brass plaques. This donation isn't a Reed family gift. It is a novice gift. It is a monument to the fact that excellence isn't bred into the bone. It's forged in the fire of being told you aren't enough. So, to my father sitting there in the front row, thank you. Thank you for the silence. Thank you for the struggle. And most of all, thank you for making sure that when I finally arrived at this stage, I didn't owe you a single second of my time. I stepped back from the microphone. The silence held for one more heartbeat, then the room erupted. But I wasn't listening to them. I was watching Elias, whose hands were trembling in his lap, finally realizing that the son he had tried to bury had just bought the cemetery. The applause was still ringing in my ears as I stepped off the stage and into the dim, heavy silence of the wings. I had expected to feel a rush of adrenaline, but instead I felt a strange, cooling stillness. That was until I saw the shadow leaning against the brickwork. Elias was waiting for me. The transition from the bright stage lights to the gloom of the backstage area made him look older, his tuxedo suddenly appearing too large for his frame. But as I drew closer, the shock in his eyes had already begun to calcify into something else, a desperate, familiar grasping for control. That was quite a performance, Marcus, he said, his voice strained but regaining that habitual edge of authority. He didn't lead with an apology. He didn't even lead with my name. He stepped into my path, forcing me to stop. I suppose I should be proud. It seems my methods worked better than even I anticipated. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and realized he was trying to rewrite the ending of the story in real time. Your methods. Don't be naive, he snapped, waving a hand toward the stage where the headmaster was still speaking. You think you got there on your own? You think that drive, that grit you just spent 10 minutes preaching about came from a vacuum? I knew exactly what I was doing that day in the study. I knew that if I gave you everything, you'd end up like every other trust fund waste of space in this room. I had to be the villain so you could become the hero. I gave you the hunger, Marcus. Your success is the direct result of the pressure I applied. It was a masterclass in narcissism. To Elias, even my rebellion was just another branch of his design. He wasn't seeing a son who had survived. He was seeing a product he had successfully manufactured through tough love. You didn't give me hunger, Elias, I said, my voice quiet and deadly. You gave me a wound. The fact that I turned that wound into an empire doesn't mean you're a visionary. It means I'm a survivor. You don't get to claim credit for the man I became in the years you weren't there to see. The school needs a legacy, Marcus, he whispered, stepping closer, his eyes darting toward the curtain as if checking for witnesses. We can fix this. We can present this donation as a joint venture. The Reed Novice Initiative. Think of what that does for the family name. It's what I always wanted for you. No, I said, stepping around him. What you wanted was a version of me you could control. You wanted a mirror. But tonight you're just a spectator. The Reed name died for me the day you pushed that letter back across the desk. This isn't a reconciliation, Elias. It's a closing statement. I walked toward the exit, leaving him standing in the dark, still trying to find a way to make my light reflect back on him. For the first time, the weight of his expectations didn't follow me out the door. The gala continued behind the heavy oak doors, the muffled sound of a string quartet playing a celebratory waltz that felt like it belonged to a century I had already outgrown. I walked down the quiet, marble-floored hallway toward the headmaster's office to finalize the paperwork. The air here was still and cool, thick with the scent of old books and polish. On the desk sat the final endowment documents. I picked up the pen, not a fountain pen like the one my father had tapped so dismissively a decade ago, but a simple, functional one. I signed my name, Marcus Novice. I had legally dropped the Reed from my identity months ago, but signing these papers felt like the official baptism. I wasn't just funding a building, I was buying back the years I spent wondering if I was enough. As I handed the folder to the school's legal counsel, the door swung open. Elias stood there, breathless, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned. He looked frantic, the polished mask of the emeritus donor cracked beyond repair. "Marcus, wait," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The photographers are outside. They want a shot of the generations of excellence. Just one photo of us together and we can handle the press release tomorrow. We'll explain that Novice is a family-held subsidiary. It's a clean win for everyone." I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't feel the familiar heat of anger or the cold hollow of longing. I felt nothing but a quiet, clinical observation. He was still trying to trade a name that was now worth less than the paper it was printed on. "The photo op is for the donors, Elias," I said softly. "And as the records show, you aren't the primary donor anymore. In fact, the board is reviewing the emeritus seats tonight. I suggested they look for members with more contemporary grit." His face went slack. "You can't be serious. After everything I taught you?" "You taught me how to be alone," I replied, walking past him into the night air. "And I've never been better at it than I am right now." I didn't look back to see if he followed. I stepped into the back of my car, the door closing with a heavy, pressurized thud that silenced the world of St. Jude's. As we pulled away from the curb, I watched the school disappear in the rearview mirror, the ivy-covered walls, the brass plaques, and the man standing under the portico who was still waiting for a son that no longer existed. I leaned back into the leather seat and watched the city lights begin to blur. For 10 years, I had been running away from a shadow. Tonight, I realized the sun had finally shifted. The shadow wasn't behind me anymore. It was gone. I wasn't a Reed and I wasn't just a CEO. I was a man who had finally paid his own way home.